Part three of our discussion of Inupiat and St. Lawrence Island Yupik culture is to talk about life on the ice, as I put it, or Inupiat traditional life ways and subsistence, specifically in a tundra environment. So I like people to think about what challenges would be involved in living in Inupiat homelands. And, probably pretty clearly you can see that a lot of it would come down to cold and light. You're in the far northern tundra. This is kind of a weather map of Utqiagvik, for example. I said stop complaining about weather in Anchorage, right? Because this is like truly intense weather where your warmest temperatures are usually around 47 and your coldest are getting down to -20 on the regular, with variations going much deeper than that, like -30 or 40. And with, as we know, significant portion of the year where you experience polar midnight, where there's very, very little sun, sunlight kind of is barely still around, not really around. And then also, of course, midnight sun very intensely. 6 months where the tundra looks more or less like this. Really, really pretty mountain ranges and then large grassy areas. But then 6 months where it's like this, and I say brrr. As you can see, I'm really great at graphic design. No, this is terrible graphic design, but um, really, really cold, and most of your plant matter is buried under snow and ice, right? So that presents obvious survival challenges of how you eat, and more specifically, how you eat and not get vitamin deficiencies, and also how you stay warm and all sorts of things. And so I said humans, the most audacious creatures on Earth, right? If you accept the evolutionary narrative, you have humans originating in Eastern Africa, and then spreading all around the world. But fascinating that, at some point humans looked at like the Siberian tundra and the Alaskan tundra and basically said, yeah, we're going to live there, right? Humans were audacious, and our culture allows us to do that, right? Our culture allows us to go from a creature who's arguably best adapted to long distance hunting in the African savanna, um, and then transform that into, okay, using culture, we can actually adapt to like basically every habitat on Earth, including some of the most arguably inhospitable, like the far northern tundra. Culture is amazing. What we do with culture, sharing of traditions, sharing of wisdom is incredible. And you see that with how people are adapted to the tundra. So let's talk a little bit about how people in Inupiat culture traditionally allowed people to thrive in this area. So number one, it's really, really cold. So you got to think about shelter. So I said before, um, igloo is just an Inuit term for home, not necessarily a snow home. So this is an igloo. As you can probably tell from a few things, this was made in historic times, and you have post-colonialism, after colonialism had started. And so you can see things like glass windows and stuff that would not have been there historically. But these are also igloos, right? These traditional structures, all of these, some of which are covered in kind of like tent-like materials during the summer or furs, some of which are sod covered, and some of which are like built out of the frame of whale bones. This is a snow igloo, and snow igloos, although they appear to have been a lot less, they were not like your permanent structure, like people, they tend to think that, right? People think Inuit people and they think, okay, like igloos, like that's the primary thing people are living in, and that's just not the case, right? But that was a type of knowledge that people had and could draw on again if they were going to be away from their village or community for a few weeks out hunting in the cold and ice. They could make these structures, and this is kind of showing you a traditional way of constructing those structures. And as you can see, it very much imitates the other larger kind of like whalebone and dirt homes or wood and sod homes, because you have this Arctic entryway that again kind of allows the heat to like go up to the top of it and the cold air to be trapped down here. You also have ventilation hole. You also would have these kind of like upraised ice benches, which makes sense because the ice is a good building medium, but then you would cover it with furs so you weren't freezing your butt off while you're on top of a chunk of ice, right? So lots of good different like adaptations to making this like a warm heat bubble, right? It's in many ways like the perfected version of a snow cave. If you've ever done a snow cave, like this is a snow cave, but it works much like it works better than and is much more sophisticated than kind of like a classic snow cave. During the warm seasons, people would often use tupik tents, which were animal skin stretched across bone and wood. As you can see here and here, especially in the more inland areas. And during much of the year, though, they would also use these whalebone and kind of wood homes. So I've already talked about that. People do longer tunnels in windier areas, which is interesting. We talked about raised sleeping benches. We talked about wood or rail support. We've already touched about this quite a bit. It's interesting that you have gut window on the south side to let in a lot of light on the south side, which makes a lot of sense if you understand how sunlight works. So really, really smart ways of adapting to kind of like in multiple different ways, maximizing the amount of heat that you get in there. Here's a nice kind of diagram of what these traditionally looked like with the Arctic entryway and a trapdoor in and the benches. Benches, of course, have the side benefit too of getting you higher up in the structure. So there's lots and lots of Alaska Native communities where you wouldn't be sleeping on a bench, you'd be sleeping on the floor. Here in the northern tundra, it makes sense. Put yourself as high as possible. You're making the most use of the heat. Yet another example. So, um, again, snow igloos more so as kind of temporary winter accommodations, but in most of the winter, people are staying in their actually like permanently constructed home, as you might imagine. Challenge number two, what do you do for food out in the tundra? And the answers are many. This is a good video that you could watch on your own time. It's from the community of Noatak, which has a population of about 600 folks last time I checked. And it's called Grocery Store of Our People, where they talk at length about kind of hunting and fishing today and gathering. And one of the things that you get the distinct impression of, and you'll realize as you look at Inupiat villages, is that there are most villages, people are still getting a tremendous amount of their food from wild sources. Even if there are grocery stores in your community, the grocery stores are often exorbitantly priced out there for logistical reasons. And so partly for that kind of pragmatic reason, and also partly because it's a deep, deep part of people's cultural tradition, people are doing a tremendous amount of their food from wild caught sources, wild gathered sources. And so this video kind of gets at that. But as far as kind of in traditional times, Inupiat culture is a foraging or hunter-gatherer tradition, as with all these other Alaska Native communities, specifically one that varies between the summer and winter. So you have that very sharp gradation, kind of almost like two seasons up there. And um, so you have kind of like people branching out over the summer and sometimes moving inland, and then people kind of often concentrating over into coastal areas in the winter and making use of that sea ice and using the sea ice to go out and hunt things like walrus or seal or even bowhead whale. And then you like drag the animal up onto the sea ice, and it's a way of getting out into the ocean. And so you kind of have again this like seasonal move out sometimes over the summer as nuclear families or family groups, and then moving back into these like winter kind of like almost villages, communities, centralized communities of several people, sometimes like 200 up to 800 people kind of coalescing into these larger communities in the winter. People lived a lot on sea mammals. Bowhead whale, absolutely key cultural keystone species, like key for Inupiat culture traditionally, and a huge part of what people were eating. Walrus is also a huge part of that. Shorebirds, seal, fish, polar bears, caribou, muskox, all of that. And from the tundra, people tend to look at a tundra and just see grass, but there's roots and there's small plants and there's berries. There's a variety of things that you can eat in the tundra if you know what to look for. I don't know why in this entire PowerPoint I don't have the proper tilde above this to make this a correct like N. For this should always have the tilde over it, so I apologize. An Inupiaq year, though, seasonal cycle of life. So this would be kind of a classic, more like coastal Inupiaq community, which was most a lot of them. So in the spring, you're collecting greens and shoots. If you're in the interior, you're hunting caribou in the spring and the fall. In the early summer, you're gathering birds and eggs and doing some whaling. By the late summer, you're moving into getting a lot of berries and roots while those are still above ice, and maybe storing them in different ways so that you have them during the winter. In the winter, you're doing a lot of seal hunting and ice fishing, and also winter is a time of song and of ceremonies. So traditionally, people um, had a variety of things like dog sleds and things to get around, and snowshoes and kayaking here up here as well. There's some really interesting ways of affecting the predator population. So, like for example, like whale, like burying bones in meat that could then spring, so that you could kill rival predators that might be like trying to like get the things that you're eating in your own village. So really fascinating because you have like wolves, for example, that'll like eat the whole chunk of meat one, and then the piece of coiled bone will spring out once the meat's digested and killed the wolf. And so people had ways of sort of like dealing with animals that were being a nuisance around their village, as far as like getting into people's kills and things like that. So that is very interesting. I talked a little bit about trading before with the messenger feast, but you would have these big, what are sometimes called in the literature trading fairs, but basically villages getting together and gift giving and trading with each other during the winter. And you'd often have trading partnerships where like more coastal Inupiat communities that had more like seal hunting and more inland communities that were doing a little more of the caribou hunting. Probably both did some of both, but you'd kind of have where you're specializing more and you'd be trading with each other at these fairs. Bowhead whales, boats, and bearded seals. I was feeling alliterative that day, clearly. Traditionally, people to get um, this would use umiak boats, which were 15 to 20 foot long, 3 foot deep. Um, and for these big boats that you would use while whaling, you would use six bearded seal skins, which would make it waterproof, and women would be the ones that would stretch that across the vessel. Traditionally, Inupiat whaling is done as a whaling crew. Where did that go? Whoops. So you would have around 10 guys. You would have the Umialik, the whaling captain. That was traditionally a very like, sacred religious role. Nowadays, it doesn't always have that connotation, but traditionally it was like that, and it's still very much a position of honor and respect, and thought of as kind of the greeter of the whale, somebody that like brought the whale in by the way of respect they showed. And so both the captain of a whaling crew and the wife of the captain had to kind of do certain like ways of acting to be in a sacred kind of space, headspace, to show that respect to the whales so that the whales will want to give themselves to these people that are living in a spiritual way. And so, if you did the reading, I think I had an optional reading, the one that was like I'm not the great hunter, my wife is. That's what they were touching about there, right? This kind of idea that um, the women at home had this like really important like sacred role in bringing the whales in. That idea of hunting not just as taking an animal, but as an animal choosing to be killed, which is a fundamentally different way of thinking about hunting. You'd have harpooners in there. If you'd bring the whale in, meat would be divided among the crews, and also there'd be helper crews, other um, parties that helped drag the whale up onto the ice, and they would also get distributed. There's like this complicated pattern of distributing meat first to the crew and to the captain, and then out through the community in a variety of different ways, like the people that helped and the people we're gifting to, and all these different things. So it's like this gifting economy, right? But it starts with the crew that got the whale first. So they would make use traditionally of the March to June northward migration of bowhead whales. How about whaling today? In the wake of commercial whaling, that devastated many whale populations. So there was a very, very intense like restriction and regulations that got put in place in the 20th century to help whale populations rebound. But it is still a cultural practice to whale, and that's like key to for a lot of these really remote communities. Like it's a key part of your food and your diet, and it's also a key thing on like a cultural level too, and like a for some people maybe on a spiritual level. And so there's been back and forth and negotiations that eventually resulted in something called the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission, which is a group of people from the different Inupiat and St. Lawrence Island Yupik communities who get together and help manage a very limited subsistence whale hunt from the different villages. And generally speaking, any given village will have like two whales you can gather that year. And you have bowhead whales that are numbering in the thousands, right? And this is Western Arctic stock, and it's been increasing with time. And so basically the point of this is AEWC and the way that they're doing whaling out there, generally speaking, has been, I would argue, fairly effective at allowing the whales to still be in a strong way in that part of the Arctic. Um, there's a little bit of scientific debate there about which population you count, but we won't get into it today. The point is, generally speaking, this has been a highly, highly limited hunt, which has been, one could argue, highly, highly sustainable. On the other hand, is really limited to what people could do traditionally, right? Saying a village can only have two whales a year. That's a very like specific regulation you put upon them. So, but it's one that's been adopted in contemporary times based on where whales are now and where the regulations are now and what people have negotiated for as far as continuing their lifeways. Whaling continues, though, to be very, very important to people, as does a variety of other kinds of subsistence. There's a whaling video, very, very cool. Traditionally, people had to cut into whales mostly with stone knives, which I just think is like so fantastic to think about, like the incredible amount of work and how good you had to be at making stone knives to make that work. But anyways, this is a video you can watch about whaling in Inupiat tradition. Another concern, of course, if you live in the tundra is not just getting food, but staying healthy from your food, and particularly the fact that for about half of the year you don't have many plants. You can store some of them, but still you don't have them like freshly growing out of the ground. And so, of course, that raises the issue of like, well, vitamin C and like, how do you not get scurvy and horrible immune systems and all sorts of other issues if you're getting vitamin C and D and well, you are getting D, but anyways, vitamin C and different things from plants. Um, and there's a lot of different answers to that, but I'll just raise two, which is that there's a cultural thing going on here and arguably also a genetic thing. So on a cultural level, there's been some very good studies, like an early landmark study by Stephenson, which shows that in Inupiat people were intentionally eating certain kinds of animal parts that were high in vitamin C or in carbohydrates, and therefore sort of using a high meat diet in the winter that still was giving them some of the core things that you would get from plants. So kind of doing closer to what nowadays gets called a carnivore diet during certain months, but doing it in a way that actually worked, as opposed to have some people nowadays don't pay attention to how to do it right, and so can screw up their body pretty bad. But here you would have cultural practices that allowed for that to actually be healthy to mostly eat meat during certain months. So, for example, certain like raw meats, certain meats that you would choose to eat raw, while others were cooked, that would allow for you to get some glycogen into your diet from still being on the meat and not having broken down yet. And then also eating whale skin, like for example, as part of muktuk, where it's like the fat and the skin together, or eating a certain seal liver, both of which are rich in vitamin C. So that's how you're not getting scurvy, is you're still getting vitamin C from whales and seals. Very, very cool. Culture has encoded into it certain things of like, well, we eat the liver, or we eat the blubber with the skin on, like things like that are like um clearly culturally adaptive, like things that are in the culture to allow people to thrive and survive. Genetic adaptation, this test was the answer for a long time of how these communities could be healthy amidst not getting as many plants in the winter. More recent research has suggested there's also a genetic component where people appear to, in some Inupiat and Yupik communities, have basically a genetic marker and that's common in these communities that aren't common in other communities that allow people to cycle in between ketogenesis faster. So ketogenesis is something that generally humans can like put themselves into where you process nutrients differently on like a high meat diet. It's like kind of like a different respiratory pathway to oversimplify. Some Inupiat and Yupik communities have like a lot of people who have the ability to cycle between ketogenesis and normal respiration or much quicker than other populations of people. What that means is basically that you could very quickly like, oh, here's plants. We're eating plants while we have them. Okay, now we're back into ketogenesis mode when we have a lot of meat. So it'd be an efficient way of using your natural respiratory systems more efficiently to acknowledge the fact that for significant parts of the year, you're going to be eating lots of meat. And even during the time when there are plants, you might be alternating heavily based on the day. So it's pretty rad. Genetic studies are very, very interesting and very, very cool. Um, Finally, though, how do people emotionally thrive, right? Anybody that's ever dealt with seasonal depression, like yours truly, knows that a significant portion of the year having limited light or up there almost no light at all during polar midnight is going to present a strong issue with emotional well-being. There's we probably don't know all the answers yet of how people were able to avoid some of that seasonal depression in traditional time periods. I'm not saying nowadays when clearly there are people that suffer with that in these communities, but like traditionally, how did you not just have like whole villages that are just like experiencing really intense seasonal depression the whole year? Well, one of the things we need to look at is how Inupiat people culturally, traditionally dealt with winter and how it was thought of And again, as a time of ceremony and trading and meeting with neighboring communities and doing song and dance and storytelling. So it's something to look forward to the entire season and something that connects you to your community, gives you lots of social outlets, and connects you to your sacred traditions and your sense of who you are as a people, right? When people are not getting much light, so to speak, as in like outside light, they're turning towards their cultural spiritual traditions for light, right? Inwardly. So there's Kargi traditionally these like ritual houses that would be where men and boys would hang out in the day, but during the evenings would become these like social center, ceremonial center, community center, especially during the winter. This is a picture of one. And you have traditionally shamans, is how it gets translated in English, but angakaks, these kind of traditional spiritual leaders who would go into trance, who would have powerful dreams. This is a great video about a particular spiritual Inupiat story, which has to do with a blind boy who was mistreated by his mother, and then a loon who is able to communicate with him because it's a sacred story and take him down into the water 3 times, and then he regains his sight. And then eventually he does something that results in the death of his mother. And then she becomes a narwhal as her hair turns into a horn. And that's where narwhal comes from. And the reason I'm bringing this up is kind of part of this like broader storytelling tradition where animals and humans are much more closely connected to each other. And there's some fluidity there, right? And the animals can communicate with humans and humans can become animals. And so understanding that spiritual tradition is like a vibrant part of Inupiat life traditionally. And sometimes stories when we get like sacred nature in indigenous traditions doesn't always mean that like every story is like here's like an animal spirit that was being nice. Sometimes it's like this kind of like gritty story, like the loon was being nice, but then like the narwhal side of the story is like pretty grim and gritty. Um, but spiritual stories, right, they have a way of helping people think about value systems and community and connection and a higher purpose. And so one could argue that the storytelling tradition in winter communities is like a huge part of them, like how people traditionally um, kept emotional well-being, particularly away from kind of modern traditions of things like psychotherapy and things like that. So really, really interesting. Finally, I want to talk. So, as we can see, with food, with shelter, with vitamins, and with emotional thriving, Inupiat culture had a million different ways of sort of adapting people to one of the hardest environments to last on Earth. So, once again, humans, the audacious species, using culture to thrive all over the planet and in the most unexpected of places. Contemporarily, by the way, Inupiat and Inuit communities can, again, there's about 34 different villages. Many of them are in the North Slope, um, and then also further south as well, a little bit. Contemporarily, this is a link to a reading that I also put on Blackboard by Barth and Adams, one of whom is an Inuit photographer, Inupiat photographer. It was in National Geographic, and I thought just really, really cool, like pictures of contemporary Inupiat villages and kind of talking about what life is like. I would also recommend to you, and in fact, later in the semester, we'll force you to watch a video called We Up from the Anchorage Museum, where there's a really cool story about a hip hop artist, a couple of different hip hop artists from Inupiat communities, um, which is a really cool insight into kind of contemporary life in certain Inupiat villages. And then also, finally, there's a link I have here. Again, you'll be able to access this when you download the slides, but it's a link to a video called How Alaska Native Women Are Healing from Generations of Trauma. And it's about traditional tattoo practices, which have, in many cases, were stigmatized or stopped being practiced, or in some cases were essentially made illegal in many parts of Alaska, but then have revived in recent decades. And you see many more people reclaiming that ancestral tradition, which I personally think is a really beautiful and amazing thing to see. So this video talks about that and specifically talks a little bit about Inupiat tattoo practices, which I think is just so awesome. Um, Nunavut. Nunavut, I wanted to briefly talk about kind of, okay, that was a little bit about Inupiat communities in Alaska nowadays. Let's talk a little bit about Inuit communities nowadays in Canada, because there's something really interesting here, which is that you essentially have a province that grew out, or a territory, I should say, that grew out of another kind of territorial area, Northwest Territories, but back in 1999 became a new territory. Basically, a portion of land became a new territory called Nunavut, and Nunavut is essentially in theory, an Inuit-run territory of Canada. So it is part of the Canadian system. It is under the Canadian federal government, but the government is overwhelmingly Inuit people. The name for it means our land in Inuktitut. The Inuit is one of the official languages. About 36,000 people live there. It's about 85% Inuit. And again, the government is mostly Inuit people at that territory level. So really, really interesting and very, very different than Alaska in terms of like how, we have this whole like ANTH corporations and like IRA tribal councils and things. Over here, you have this like whole like territory. It's almost like if we in the US had like an entire state and that state was like um, indigenous run and 85% of the population was indigenous people in it. That's essentially what we're talking about with Nunavut on the Canadian side.